what is emotion?
This is the part of the book that 20-year-old me needed to hear, because when I was 20-ish, I was not convinced 100% that emotions were like a real thing. I sort of had this image of emotions as like an airy fairy somewhere out there feeling.
Very gauzy and yes.
Yeah. And I needed science in my mid-30s to prove to me that emotions were real, even though I was literally a professional musician and expressing emotion was my job. I guess the performance aspect of it made me like able to separate myself. Okay. Emotions are cycles that happen in your body. They are neurological events. And when I say neurological, I mean not just happening in your brain, but your whole nervous system. The intelligence of your body extends to your nervous system from the top of your head to the tip of your toes and also beyond your skin. Emotions are an involuntary neurological response. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
I just found that so helpful.
The metaphorical version is feelings are tunnels. You have to go all the way through them to get the light at the end.
Okay, I have that double highlighted here. I have a couple things. Just about every system in your body responds to the chemical and electrical cascade activated by emotion. Emotion is automatic, instantaneous. It happens everywhere and it affects everything. In short, emotions are tunnels. If you go all the way through them, you get to the light at the end. Exhaustion happens when we get stuck in an emotion.
Emotions have a beginning, a middle, and an end. A lot of us are taught to believe that if we fix the problem that caused the stress or the emotion, then we will have dealt with the emotion itself. And so we believe when we are told that, you dealt with the issue, so you should be done feeling by now. So why do you still have all these feelings? We don't want to hear about your feelings anymore. Your feelings should be done because the situation is done. So let it go. We are so tired of hearing about you and your feelings. And you're like, I must behave myself emotionally so that I do not interfere with anyone else's well-being. And so I am now officially done with my feelings. And you smile and you shove it down into some organ system. I don't know which one. And then it lives inside you.
And it metastasizes, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's not necessarily the worst choice you could make in that moment. In some moments, smiling and being polite and walking away and containing and shoving it all down and hiding it can make you safer. I mean, yes, but now finish that feeling. Go back and revisit it and go through the whole cycle.
Get the rest of the way through the tunnel.
Emotions are tunnels. If you go all the way through them, you get to the light at the end. Exhaustion happens when we get stuck in an emotion. That podcast was really helpful to me whenever I first heard it a couple of weeks ago. Lately, I've been starting to feel overwhelmed by the pandemic, news of variants of concern, the mixed messages we've been getting from government and public health officials. How concerned should I be? What's the right thing to do in this or that situation? Well, so-and-so, they're doing such and such. Should that make me less worried or should that make me more worried? We've collectively been stuck in the emotions of uncertainty, caution, and suspended grief for over a year now. Like many of you, I'm exhausted by the pandemic, and that question of how to process all of those emotions brought on by this experience that is not yet over, that really hits home for me. I feel stuck in that tunnel, stuck and exhausted. So I find myself relating quite directly to the sleepy disciples in this story of Jesus' late-night prayer session in the garden. It had been such a long week for them. The inaugural parade that we call the triumphal entry, the confrontation with the merchants and bankers in the temple, intense lectures from Jesus, more direct confrontation with the religious leaders, the daily grind of a long commute on foot, complicated by the huge crowds of pilgrims filling the city for the Passover holiday. That was their week. And then that night was the Passover meal, meant to be a celebration, holiday festivities, but filled with the haunting overtones of the imminent death threat that Jesus faced. That meal also brought to a head the open secret that Judas, one of the trusted 12, was actively preparing to betray them all. To which Jesus added the accusation that it wasn't just Judas, none of them would remain faithful. They would all run away from him before this ordeal was through. That's intense. So yeah, there was a lot going on externally and internally for these men. I don't think it's too much of a projection to hear them groaning when Jesus led them out into the garden for a late night prayer session. And I can imagine their relief when Jesus told them to wait here while he went off by himself. Finally, a few minutes to close their eyes and check out for a while. But rather than leaving them to their sleep, Jesus keeps coming back and waking them up, begging them to keep their eyes open just for an hour. Stay awake with me. This is your time of trial as well as mine. So don't check out. Be present, watch, and pray. Let's zoom out for a minute. As you know, part of the beauty of the Gospels is that they are working on multiple levels. Beyond the people and events as they happened, these are also stories told to a particular audience for a particular reason. A couple of months ago, I showed you these images of the church in Antioch, around 40 years after the time of Jesus. This was a group of Christ followers within a fairly large Jewish community in a major city of the Roman Empire. When the Roman legions destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, the Jewish community in Antioch was shaken deeply. They had relatives who were killed in the fighting and the fires. Their status as Jews would now earn them suspicion and abuse from their neighbors. By association, if not active participation, they were rebels against the empire. On top of that, their religious identity and practice as faithful Jews were shaken. No temple for sacrifice and purification. No priests to act as mediators between them and God. No holy city to call them home. They had already begun to focus on Jesus as the center of their faith, and these particular Jews had, but they were doing that Christian thing in a wholly Jewish way. They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of their religion, not a departure from it. So when Matthew, or whoever wrote the gospel in Matthew's name, was writing to this young Christian community in Antioch, all of that deep, traumatic, unwanted change kept coming up. How do we respond to this crisis? How will we cope with our losses? What will carry us through to the other side? Will we even make it through? And what will life on the other side be like when certainly it cannot go back to normal? Imagine a community caught up in those questions, those kinds of emotions of anxiety, grief, anger, fear, loneliness, despair. Imagine those feelings piling up in the tunnel, the exhaustion of being stuck there and not able to move forward. Can you see how this scene in the garden, with the disciples facing a different crisis not of their making, with their exhaustion piling up, overwhelmed by all that's going on, can you see how this scene might connect with those Christians in Antioch? When Jesus speaks in the story, the message is not just for the disciples. Please stay here, stay present, and awake with me. How would the Christian Jews in Antioch make it through these massive changes? By staying present, by paying attention. Pray with me, Matthew tells them, in the voice of their rabbi. That is courage, finding ways to be fully present in crisis. As I said, I can totally relate to the disciples wanting to check out at that point. I was at the dentist the other day and found myself waiting alone in the dentist chair for 5 or 10 minutes, just waiting for the hygienist to come in, which is not exactly the same as waiting for betrayal and crucifixion, but it's still further than I want to be along the scale of impending torture. Sitting in the chair, I really wanted to pull out my phone to distract myself. I wished that I had brought my book. I thought about closing my eyes for a nap. I ended up just letting my mind drift off, indulging in some somber worries about the increased risks of visiting a dentist during a pandemic. When the hygienist finally did come, she leaned my chair back and handed me a remote control so that I could find a nice Netflix program about Hawaii and pretend that I wasn't even in the room while she worked on my teeth. That's right, my dentist now has Netflix. Let me know if you want a referral. A lot of us follow similar patterns in situations like this. One way to understand these patterns is through a relatively new model called AEDP, Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. I learned about this from Mike McHargue's latest book, and I also posted some links to more information on this model in the written version of this sermon. By my very simplistic understanding of the model, most of us have a healthy, natural core state, the base, where we are calm, we are curious about the world. That's the base layer of personality. But when something happens, a change or conflict, big or small, it really could be anything that brings up an emotional response. When anything happens, we leave this core state and move into an affected emotional state of anger, surprise, arousal, disgust, etc. And those are involuntary and natural and often very helpful responses. But this model points out that many of us have learned that at least some of these emotions are not safe. We've learned to associate them with shame or violence or instability or unfulfilled expectations. And so many of us have learned to bounce right through these core emotions into this second category of inhibiting affects, like anxiety, worry, guilt, and shame. So when I go to the dentist, I feel fear. Chances are good that some pain is going to be involved. But like many of you, long ago I learned that if I feel pain when I go to the dentist, well, that is my fault. It's what I deserve. Because if I would just take better care of my teeth, if I would floss regularly and not eat sweets, well then trips to the dentist would be all sunshine and butterflies. The pain is my fault, and so I feel shame. Going to the dentist has revealed that I'm a bad person. Who's with me? So I skip through that fear. I deal with it, the fear and the pain, by internalizing it into shame. I deserve this. But now I have to do something with that bad feeling. And that leads into the third category, defensive affects. Humor, denial, passive aggression, acting out, compulsion, etc. At the dentist, my go-to is shutting down. I withdraw into the TV if there is one, or just into some mental shelter deep within. Don't talk to me, don't bother me. I shut down conversations. I will lie about how often I floss. I will smile and nod and pretend to be interested in whatever the latest dental product is that they want me to try. Totally fake, just anything to take that pressure away and get the heck out of there. Now, none of that is inherently bad. As McHargue puts it, the unique ways that you inhibit your emotions and the unique ways you defend yourself from feeling bad are not just okay. They are crucial for all of us in helping to navigate our lives and the world around us. Our defenses become a problem only when they trap us in the cycle of inhibiting and defensive affects. Sometimes we can spend so much time spinning around the triangle that we miss out on experiencing our feelings as they were meant to be felt. Our emotions serve a purpose. They are vital information about our surroundings and internal workings, alerting us to experiences, positive and negative, that we really don't want to miss. Dental pain has a purpose. As a human animal, I need strong, healthy teeth for eating, for fighting, for sex appeal. Pain in my teeth is a call to action. There's an issue here that I need to attend to before it gets worse and I lose all these advantages that my teeth bring me. But if I shift that pain into shame and that shame into denial and shutting down, well, that actually prevents my taking appropriate action, like routine dental care. And shutting down and not taking care of my teeth will lead to more pain, and that leads to more shame, and around I go. McCarg explains that emotions follow this kind of curve, a rapid escalation of intensity, and that is scary. But then comes a peak and a release that can bring relief. He says, our feelings can come on quickly, but in a supportive environment, we can process them fully. When this happens, our feelings taper off and fade to a resolution that returns us to core state soon after they feel like they are too intense. But instead of letting our emotions play out, many of us cut off our feelings with inhibiting or defensive affects. When we learn to bypass our basic emotions, we never experience the relief that comes from processed emotions, and instead fear their intensity. Like Brené Brown and her podcast guest said, emotions are tunnels. If you go all the way through them, you get to the light at the end. Exhaustion happens when we get stuck in the middle, stuck in an emotion. In my trip to the dentist, I made it through to the light at the end. I felt the fear and a bit of pain, and I remembered to accept that as a nudge to give my teeth the attention they need. I was even grateful for the pain and the fear as a reminder of that need. But yeah, I'm already a little bit anxious about my next trip for a cleaning in 6 months. And that's okay. The goal is not to avoid the feelings or to correct them, but to embrace them. One more word from Mike McCarg. I believe that when you learn to appreciate all your feelings, to accept them as a vital part of you, you'll begin a journey that helps you escape the cycle of spinning around the triangle of core, inhibiting, and defensive affects, and instead acquaint yourself with the clarity and calm that come from riding an emotional wave all the way through. That sounds hard. That sounds better, doesn't it? I see that pattern happening in this scene at the Garden of Gethsemane. Fun vocabulary note of the day: Gethsemane is Aramaic for oil press. This was a place where the fruit was squeezed to distill its essence. A literal pressure cooker, which is exactly what this story is about. In the time of distress, the disciples are caught up in this cycle of inhibiting and defensive affects: worry, blame, guilt, defensiveness, shutting down, and acting out. That's entirely understandable given the circumstances. Self-preservation, physical and emotional, that was a natural response to this pressure cooker. But where the disciples acted out and shut down, Jesus leaned into the emotions of the experience. I like how the Inclusive Bible translates it. Jesus took along Peter, James, and John and started to feel grief and anguish. That sounds intentional. Jesus found the right time and place to go into that tunnel, and then he rode the wave all the way through. Jesus' practice of choice was prayer, an honest, self-aware, relational, repeated cry to his Father God, Abba, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by, but not what I want, what you want. I'm scared. I need help. I want to get away, but I'm committed to this. I want to see it through. Can you see the wave? 3 times he prayed that prayer, and each time the disciples fell asleep while he prayed. Again, no judgment on that. But look at the results. When the critical moment came, the disciples bolted. They abandoned their convictions and their friend. They were stuck in that tunnel. They couldn't find their way through when it mattered most. And Jesus, having gone all the way through the tunnel, found his resolve and courage on the other side. Let us be on our way. Look, my betrayer is here. Jesus is the one who prepared for the journey, who remains the calm, whole presence, faithful to his true self. He was who he wanted to be all the way to the end. As Alexander Shia puts it, Jesus is the model for remaining emotionally and spiritually present in a time of distress and uncertainty. And that's the gospel writer's message to the Christian Jews in Antioch. Stay awake through the changes, unpleasant as they might be, and you will come through as the people you want to be on the other side. That's what Jesus did, and that's what we are invited into. Of course, Matthew doesn't use the language of AEDP and inhibiting and defensive affects. The gospel writer speaks of faithfulness, of following in Jesus' footsteps, of embracing being poor in spirit, of finding blessing in grief. But the truth is the same. The only way through this difficult thing you're facing is to go through it, to commit to it, to experience it fully, to take even this as an opportunity to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. And when we do that, no matter what comes, we will find that even something as evil as the cross can be turned into good. Even something as empty as a tomb can be filled with meaning. When we follow all the way through the tunnel, we find the light at the end. That's the Gospel of Matthew. I know it's not any easier to do that now than it was then. I know it has been a year filled with emotions delayed and avoided, and even when we have courageously attended to our fear and grief, there's always more coming at us the next day. The waves keep on coming, and the tunnel never seems to end. I know that's how it is for me too. I've really been struggling some days. I'm definitely stuck in that loop of inhibiting and defensive affects so much of the time. For better sometimes, for worse others. And so while the gospel calls us to stay awake, to attend to our emotions, to be fully present all the way through that tunnel, don't forget that the gospel also tells us that whether we're managing that well or poorly, we are never alone in that journey. The Gospel of Matthew ends where it began. The writer began this story with a long list of ancestors, each with a story of their own struggle. Tamar, Rehoboam, and Josiah, and all the others. Some successful, some definitely not. You are not the first to go through this struggle, and you won't be the last. This story did not begin with you, and it will not end with you either. That's where Matthew started. That's the foundation of everything that follows. And then at the end of chapter 1, after that long list of God's people in the past, came the reminder of a new life, a new child, this one with the name Emmanuel, God with us. That is what the disciples of Matthew's gospel found, that God was with them, beginning to end. Those faithless friends asleep in the garden, after their betrayal, they came back around. They regrouped. They learned what they had missed. And eventually they found the courage to give it another go. They paid attention to what they had missed before. And they found it. They found the confidence to face their fears, to fully experience the life that Jesus had invited them into. They found that power, surprisingly enough, inside them. They called it the Spirit of Christ, alive in them. And they really did follow the way of Jesus in the living and in the dying. And that witness was so powerful that it spread across the Roman Empire and beyond. That's the final message of Matthew to the Christian Jews of Antioch. This is your story too. This has always been your story. And now it's your turn to choose to trust. And they did. In Antioch and all across the empire, they chose and trusted so well that their story was passed on and on, finally reaching us here 2,000 years later on the other side of the world. And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Emmanuel, God is with us, and no tunnel, no grave can separate us from the love of God. This is our story too, and we are not alone. May God give us the courage and trust to follow. Amen.